Psalms 4, the Psalm of David. Answer me when I call. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. Be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts on your beds and be silent. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, "Who will show us some good?" Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. You have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. In peace I will both lie down and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. This psalm is a lament and opens with an appeal to God to hear the psalmist's prayer and to remedy his distress. The source of his troubles are unnamed enemies whom he rebukes in verse 2, and warns in verse 3, and instructs in verse 4 and 5. Verse 6 and 7 focus again on God, appealing to him to bring prosperity and joy not only to the psalmist, but to the many. The psalm is known as an evening prayer because the final verse in verse 8 proclaims that in spite of the distress, the psalmist can go to sleep in peace, knowing that God cares for him. The title names David as the composer of this psalm. David was often in distress over those who sought to undermine him, as in Saul and Absalom, to name a two. Reading the psalm as a prayer of David would identify the many in verse 6 as his followers or subjects. Verse 1, have mercy on me. The psalm begins with a typical lament by calling on God to answer prayer. The second parallelism of the verse cites distress from which relief is sought, but as is typical in the psalms, the specific nature of the distress is not delineated, so the prayer may serve as a model for later worshippers experiencing distress that is similar, though not identical, to the composer's. The next section, though, reveals that the psalmist's distress is caused at least in part by his foes. Verse 2 and 3, glory into shame. The psalmist continues the lament by asking, how long? A question found in a number of prayers. The phrase indicates that the sufferer has been long in his pain and sees no end in sight. He thus appeals to God's pity, suggesting that perhaps enough is enough. The psalmist asks his opponents how long they will turn his glory into shame. Here he might refer to his own glory, his good reputation that the enemies have been seeking to undermine. The title names David as the composer, and there are good examples from the historical books of those who sought to undermine his reputation. Or perhaps God himself is the psalmist's glory, and the foes are seeking to undermine God's authority. In support of the latter is the second parallelism in verse 2 that accuses the foes of worshipping false gods, which the psalmist suggests is delusional. By worshipping false gods, they would turn God's glory into shame. In verse 3, the psalmist warns the enemies that they are troubling the wrong person. The psalmist has God's ear. He names himself as God's faithful servant, a contradistinction to those who serve false gods. God will hear him and act upon his prayers. Here we see the psalm of lament turning into an expression of confidence that God will rescue him from his distress. Verse 4-5. Do not sin. In the light of his expectation that God will hear him, the psalmist gives advice to his enemies. He tells them to tremble, that is, fear God, and not sin. He envisions the foes plotting during the night as they go to sleep, but advises them rather to be self-critical, search your hearts, and to remain silent. Paul cites this verse in Ephesians chapter 4 verse 26. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. But according to the Greek version, in your anger do not sin, addressing the instruction to his fellow Christians to guide them in their attributes towards one another. The psalmist instructs them not only to refrain from sinful behavior, but also to act properly towards the Lord. They should not worship false gods, but rather offer sacrifices to God and trust in Him, as the psalmist himself does. Verse 6-7. Give us prosperity. The psalmist is not alone in his call for relief from distress. In verse 6, he quotes the word many, whose request for prosperity implies that this is lacking at the present. That the prosperity includes material things is indicated in verse 7, where the psalmist pleads with God to fill his heart with joy as a consequence of providing them with grain and new wine. Verse 8. I will sleep in peace. Although this is a lament, the psalmist concludes by expressing his confidence in God in the midst of distress. He acknowledges that his security comes only from God, and thus he can sleep well at night. Although the title names David as the composer of this lament, it was written for public use. Those who suffer distress can pray this psalm and turn their anxieties over to God. The psalm expresses confidence in God in the midst of troubles to encourage peaceful sleep. David's greatest son, Jesus, is an illustration of the attribute expressed in this psalm. Suffering anxiety about his forthcoming trial in Jerusalem, Jesus submits to his Father's will in the Garden of Gethsemane and expresses the peace of mind articulated by verse 8. In peace I will both lay down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety.